remarkable changes of Christianity in the United States since I was a young person, when mainstream Protestantism was dominant in the United States. And now it's been replaced by a very strident evangelical Christianity, which has a political agenda. They're very strong supporters of Trump. There's a kind of defend America. There's a racist element to it. It's sort of for, privileges white, old white, heterosexual, suburban and small town people. So, someone like me who, was raised in a whole different kind of Christianity, even finds it difficult to tell people I'm a Christian, because then they'll immediately assume I'm one of those kind of people.
You have engaged with the idea of God in various cultural contexts, the idea of God. And it's very natural that the idea of God is also subject to all kind of historical upheavals, and therefore association between God and war, association between God and various kind of social churning. And pandemic is the best time to think of the rebirth of God, if not death of God anymore.
We live in very interesting times socially and individually. And socially, we have to think of who we are as a community and how do we keep ourselves safe. And the pandemic really draws out two opposite kinds of tendencies. One is globalization, to reach out and to move beyond national boundaries and want to try to share our common humanity because we're all affected with the same thing. But at the same time, there's a defensiveness that leads to tribalization and an intense xenophobic nationalism. And that's the other side. These two diametrically different tendencies are taking place. And both of them, I think, are related to an individual issue, and that's the one that you brought up, and that's the awareness of our own mortalities. And we're aware of our own mortality by seeing others who become sick, and in some cases very quickly die in a horrible disease, or others who have a lingering illness, and at some level of reality, we are all aware that it could be us. We could catch the virus, and we don't know if it's going to be serious or not. We know that some people it's sort of like the flu. They have a slight little problem and it disappears. And for others, often older people, my generation, it can become much more serious, particularly if they have other complications, and it can quickly lead to a very miserable form of death and a very lonely form of death. All death is lonely, really. But if you are in a situation of this extremity and there are people around you that you don't know, they're not your family, it makes it even more difficult. So what does this have to do with God? I think it has everything to do with God. I mean, the very idea is a human invention. And in saying that, I don't think I'm sacrilegious. I've said what many theologians have said. We try to imagine the absolute. We try to imagine the ineffable in some way that we can grapple with it, and that in some way that it can become our friend rather than our enemy. And I think the idea of God does that. So I don't make fun of it. I don't disparage it. I think it plays a very useful role in human imagination, in allowing us simply to endure, to survive with the sense of our own mortality and our own finitude. The fact that even if we don't think about death, we certainly think about the degree to which we humans are so enormously limited by our faculties. We have, we think in only like 3 dimensions, and physicists already tell us there are many more dimensions to reality that we can't even imagine. I'm fascinated by when I drive. I we live out in the desert, and I have to drive to the University of California, Santa Barbara to teach. It's a 3.5-hour drive. I don't do it every day. I do it once a week, but often I listen to books on tape. And now I'm listening to a book on quantum physics. And you're saying, what do you know about quantum physics? The answer is nothing, absolutely nothing. but that's why I'm listening to it, you know. and the other day Carlos Ravello was this Italian physicist who writes wonderfully. It was in the middle of a conversation. He says, you know, up to now I haven't talked about the concept of time. And time is really not important for what we've just now discussed. It really is a meaningless concept. And I'm saying, what? We live in time. We can't imagine our existences other than in time space. Mm-hmm. And you're telling us that these are rather unimportant aspects of the reality about what you're discussing.
No,
I think it puts us in perspective that we're so limited in our imagination that even existentially, if not in terms of our mortality, we reach out for ways to try to express this infinitude, this absolutism, and that's where God comes in.
No, the reason why I underlined the relation of God as an idea with history is one, because of your monograph on which highlights the relation of God with war, number one. Number two, we have seen in historical trajectory, we have seen various kinds of new gods have emerged in response to calamities, pandemic, or disease. Epidemiologists have also pointed it out. And say, for example, an anthropologist like Susan Wadley studied and discussed Shitala Mata, which was, and that goddess was in response to a particular kind of fever. And likewise, various other kind of gods and goddesses, new gods and goddesses have emerged in various kind of situations. In India, there was a new goddess who emerged in 1975. She was called Santoshi Mata. And many of the film studies scholars have discussed the emergence of Santoshi Mata. And 1975, yes, there was a film as well, very popular one. And and it was in response to a different kind of political situation in India. Likewise, do you foresee the possibility of the emergence of a new god or new goddess who would be responding to this pandemic, particularly if it is about Hindu pantheon of gods and goddesses, number one. Number two, I was also thinking of asking you whether the new gods, whichever god would emerge in any part of the world, they would not be divorced from the context, social contexts in which we encounter contestations of identities.
Yes, answers to both of those things. I mean, extreme times lead to extreme religion. And whether this is a new form of religion, new gods or goddesses, or whether this is simply an aberration or an extreme form of existing religion, and often autocratic religious movements emerge in difficult times, all of which is understandable. People are grasping, they want to grasp onto something. They want a rudder in the storm. They want a sense of some safe harbor when they feel like the world is at storm around them and that their reality is fragile and is collapsing. All of that is understandable. What is regrettable is that sometimes that these are autocratic movements that are easily manipulated by people who are self-consciously power hungry and are trying to, or maybe have a political program in mind. So one can abide by these extreme forms of religion if they're not dangerous, if they don't intrude on in the public in a way that try to insert themselves into all of our lives. I'm willing to put up with my neighbor's aberrations, and they can have whatever crazy fantasies they want, as long as they're not going to as long as they're not bothering me, and worse, as long as they're not endangering me in some way. But of course that's the threat of any period of social unrest, that it will lead to imagined solutions that then can become a part of the problem and become problematic.
But even without gods, there could be mobilization of the devotees, and that's what, or maybe it's not a new god; it's the same old god. Say, for example, a pair of divinity like Radha Krishna could be a pivot to mobilize new kind of devotion. That's again related to your work,
Yes.
or new saints could be brought into picture, such as your discussion in the context of Punjab, and with those new saints, mobilization of devotion could take place. If you could say something about that.
Yeah, now you're referencing something many years ago, from my latest book to my earliest book.
Yes.
My latest book, as you said, is God at War, where we try to understand the relationship between religion and warfare. And I seize on an idea propounded by Robert Bellah of religion as alternative reality. And in my mind, that makes sense. It's a way that we deal with the troubling aspects of reality in a way that frames reality in a different way, that points to an absolute that is not going to be troubled by the social unrest of our time. And war does the same thing. War also, in its own way, is an alternative reality. It's a weird template of reality. It throws civil order on its head, upside down. Instead of being able to negotiate our differences with others, we simply want to kill them. We have license to kill them. You don't have license to kill people in ordinary society. That's not something that your neighbors would put up with very long. But if you're a soldier and there's war, then quite the opposite. You're honored. You're thought that you are defending society in some really peculiar way. So I wanted to try to understand that and its connection. Why war always seems to need God. Why God is always marching along the soldiers.
Like God save America, kind of.
That's right. And the other way around. Every religion is full of war. Think of the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, but also the Hebrew Bible and the great cataclysm at the end of the world in the Book of Revelations and New Testament. The Quran, every religious tradition has war. So the two templates of alternative reality in some ways reinforce each other. In some ways they're competitive, but also they reinforce themselves. But it seems to me there are also ways in which the alternative reality can serve a social purpose. And this was my first book to which you refer. As a graduate student at University of California in Berkeley, I had two goals when I was thinking of my thesis topic. And one is I wanted to go back to India, because I'd been to India after my first set of graduate work on religion and international relations at Columbia University, and taught at Punjab University and for a year, and then was in the state of Bihar working with Jayaprakash Narayan on famine relief for a year. And I found India wonderful to think with, not only wonderful as a place and just wonderful people, but also just enormously interesting. And then in California, as in New York before, I'd been involved in social movements, political movements, in the civil rights movement, bring, freedom and independence to people of all ethnic backgrounds in the United States, African Americans especially, and the movement against the war in Vietnam. So I wanted to look at a social movement, and particularly one that in some ways involve religion as well as social change and politics. And one day going over the Indian census of 1930, an old British document, there was a little paragraph that said, the revolt of the Untouchables. I said, this is interesting. What was the revolt of the Untouchables? It turned out, well, they had formed a new religion in order to list themselves not as Hindu or Sikh or Muslim in the Punjab, but in this new religion called Adharm, which would give them political leverage because representation in the Congress, in the Parliament, was assigned on the basis of religion. Oh. And I was thinking, what a clever idea. What smart people. How interesting. A perfect combination of what I was interested in. India, religion, social movements. I need to find out about this. And so I packed up my bags and went to India because there was nothing written about it. The only way I could find out about it was go and talk with people, which again seemed like a splendid idea to me. I had spent too much time in the library and I was sick of books. And the idea of going out to villages and talking with people just sounded splendid. So that's what I did for a year and immersed myself in the Punjab, based in Jalandhar as well as Chandigarh and Amritsar. And then in the process found this old man, Mangu Ram, who had been the founder of the movement. He was in his 90s, I think, when I saw him in his farm near Gershankar in Hoshiarpur district, kind of sitting on a charpoy, smoking a hookah. And I went up and in my kind of broken Punjabi and said, explained that I was a student from California and I wanted to talk with him. And he puffed on his hookah and then he looked up and in perfect English, he said, California, he said, I used to live in Fresno. Fresno. I mean, Fresno is not one of the great cities of California. It's just a rural town, but he had come to California to be a farm worker, a farm laborer, and then he got swept up in a movement called the Gutter Movement, which is a movement of independence, mutiny, that was being founded at the time in 1909. And he was a very stalwart member of the Gutter Party who was going to go back to India and foment the revolution, but British spies intercepted their boat in the Philippines. It's a very exciting story. But the end of the story was that when he finally got back to the Punjab, he decided the people he needed to liberate was his own people. He was a Chamar, and he felt that the scheduled castes were, that was an enslavement that he could work at. Yes, he was for independence of India from Britain, but he was also for independence of his own people. And that's where very self-consciously he helped to form the Adhar movement and associated with Ravi Das. And the Ravi Das movement, which actually predated Adhar to a large extent, but really got a great deal of support from that movement. The Ravi Das movement is in some ways outlasted Adhar, and it's become really a major movement, not just in the Punjab, but other parts of North India. So it was very interesting to see this development in which religion, in the title of the book that came out of that dissertation was called Religion as Social Vision. And so even in that early book, I was thinking of how religion plays an alternative reality as a social vision for people who want to imagine Indian society in a way in which all are equal. And to do that because the whole idea of caste is undergirded with religious concepts, that meant to some degree rethinking religion. So it was really a very intelligent, sophisticated way of analyzing both the problem and the solution. If the social fabric is undergirded by religion, you have to some way reconceive religion. Right. And that's what they were doing. A very interesting development. I'm still very impressed with the sophistication of that strategy and the effectiveness of it. I mean, they were able to get large numbers of people to record their their religion as Adharm and really make a difference in that particular election. And they continue through the Ravi Das movement to provide an identity and a point of pride for scheduled caste people throughout Punjab and throughout North India.
Let me take it forward and put in place another anxiety that we have vis-a-vis religion. And that's the anxiety, as you rightly mentioned in the very beginning, about the political manipulation of the religious symbols, religious structure for certain kind of political agenda. And in that context, one was wondering whether religion has been always vulnerable to various kind of forces at large, whether religion has been always vulnerable to machinery which can manipulate it for serving its own agenda. It's in the context of various kind of historical examples of religion being in service of, at times, state or other kind of authorities, and philosophers, and then subsequently social scientists almost waged a struggle against that relation between religion and politics, and they try to also resurrect their own version of religiosity, be it Saint-Simonian kind of internationalism or something else, some kind of scientific positivism. And in that context, one gets to see that there are all kind of mercantile that gives you an option to transcend religion and be spiritual. And these are the new formations of religiosity. So do you, in your reasoning, do you come to this stage, this very contemporary manifestation of how people in collaboration with market and other kind of forces are trying to respond to the vulnerability, the historical vulnerability of religion?
Of course, it is vulnerable to humans in whatever context they exist, and for whatever reason they want to try to relate the deeper aspects of life to the world around them. I don't think we should be surprised about that or ignore it. I know there are certainly people who are deeply religious who will assert that religion never changes, that it is built on a bedrock of faith, and I think that's fine. It's certainly true that there is a bedrock of faith that in one's own life as well as historically that people refer to, but the way in which people assert that and the way in which people relate that to the world around them is very contextual, and it can change almost rapidly. You know, I'm a Christian, and I'm fascinated with the history of my own tradition, which is a very curious one because you know, it begins as a Jewish sect, a kind of cult within Judaism that is very political. It's related to the insurrection against the Roman Empire. And Jesus is accused and then ultimately tried and killed as a revolutionary, as somebody who is trying to create a kingdom that will be in competition with the Roman Empire. So it begins in some ways in a political context. And then the Apostle Paul takes this idea out of Judaism and takes it into the Mediterranean world, which to early Christians make no sense. How can you possibly be Christian if you're not Jewish? Because you know, the whole idea is, you know, the manifestation of the Jewish tradition. And Paul says, "Oh, don't worry, we couldn't be Jewish in our heart." And you know, it's the kingdom of God he's talking about anyway. It's not just and so he makes it into a Mediterranean religion. But in the early Mediterranean world, there's a lot of Mithraism, you know, the Zoroastrianism, the Egyptian. There are a lot of different religions. Mediterranean world was a very global kind of context, and Christians weren't thought very well of, because they resisted being a part of the Roman Empire and being in the army. They were pacifist, basically. They were rather cruelly oppressed until the 4th century, when an Emperor Constantine decided to accept Christianity of all religions that he could have chosen. And Mithraism was the most dominant. Why did he choose that? But he didn't. He chose it. So suddenly Christianity now has become the religion of an empire. It's a little pacifist cult. It has to switch gears. Suddenly it has to justify armies. It has to justify conquest of nations. And you have a bishop in North Africa, Augustine, suddenly trying to think how do we make sense of this? So he comes up with the idea that, there are two cities. There's a city of God and there's cities of man. And Jesus was talking about the city of God, where everybody was peaceful and you could, turn the other cheek. All that all works. But we live in the city of man. Yeah. And it's a greedy, desperate, we for the sake of justice, we have to, apply force. We have to justify a certain amount of military action. And so suddenly Christianity becomes a whole different kind of thing.
Right.
And it has ever since. And ever since it's taken all of these different turns. Even today, I can see remarkable changes of Christianity in the United States since I was a young person, when mainstream Protestantism was dominant in the United States. And now it's been replaced by a very strident evangelical Christianity. Which has a political agenda. They're very strong supporters of Trump. There's a kind of a defend America. There's a racist element to it. It's sort of for, privileges white, old white, heterosexual, suburban and small town people. So, someone like me who, was raised in a whole different kind of Christianity, even finds it difficult to tell people I'm a Christian, because then they'll immediately assume I'm one of those kind of people.
Right.
Because in some ways the Protestant Christianity has been hijacked, or in my mind, but transformed the way religion changes in exactly the way you're talking about. And here it's within my own generation. It hasn't been centuries of change. It's just been a couple of decades. So you're absolutely right. Religion is a human invention, and it changes as humans change. And it's subject to all the frailties that humanity is heir to.
For a variety of reasons, maybe commitment to the secular goals that were set up as important goals for social sciences, modern social sciences. It may be commitment to those secular goals, or maybe commitment to the idea of modernization, modernization theory being very prevalent at one point of time in 60s, 70s.
Yes, and one can imagine, and there are forms of religiosity that are perfectly compatible with elements of modernity, with the Enlightenment vision of nationality. I'm one of those people. I'm a student of the Enlightenment, as you are, and we like to think that reason will prevail and people can, civilly discuss their differences and come to some sort of consensus.
Right. An anthropologist like Gananath Ubesekere would, however, add more nuances to it by suggesting that we are doing social sciences, anthropology, sociology, and other cognate disciplines of social sciences. We are progenies of two kinds of enlightenment. One is obviously originated to René Descartes' enlightenment, René Descartes onward. And then the other is enlightenment coming from our respective religious traditions. In his context, it was Buddhist traditions, right? So enlightenment itself is a complicated experience for a lot of social scientists. But then because of prevalence of secular goals or modernization perspective, probably there was a strange kind of skepticism about religion in the beginning, when social scientists were turning their critical glances toward it. And perhaps that led to a particular approach to religion And that approach might have helped us in great deal. However, it has also delimited our understanding.
Yes, I mean the very term religion is to some extent an Enlightenment creation, and it's it relates to the idea. It actually plays a political context, and it was, I think, in part because of particularly in France, with the domination of church lands and the control of large areas of geography as well as politics, dominated by the church, and a desire, understandable and rightful desire, to remove this kind of influence from public life. And the desire was to put religion in a box, and to do that, one had to have a box, and the box was the very word religion, which is the scholar of religion, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who founded the Harvard Center for World Religion, has a wonderful book on the meaning and end of religion, and where he talks about the invention of the word religion. It doesn't exist even in English more than a couple hundred years ago, and the reason for that is that what we think of as religion was seamlessly a part of cultural tradition. That is, it was just in the air. It was in culture. And so if one wanted, universities, of course, colleges were started as ways of training clergy. And if one wanted to study what we now think of sociology, one would study moral theology. And if one wanted to study what we think of as biology or evolution, in the case of Darwin, who was trained to be a theologian, one would go into a kind of physical theology. They were all forms of religion. Adam Smith, was trained as a theologian, the great economist. But it came out of the tradition of moral theology. How does one lead a good life? How does one imagine? And the unseen hand that Adam Smith talks about, that's supposed to knit together all of the greed of individual capitalists, is the unseen hand of God. So if you don't have faith, the whole system doesn't work, because it's built on the notion that God has a kind of design and has given individual self-interest as an incentive in the divine kind of network of activity that will work towards the common good. Unfortunately, that doesn't always work so well, at least to people with the kind of Marxist critique like my own. But you can see how what we think of as religion, this is true of every tradition. It's true in India, the great astronomy that you see in evidence in Delhi, or the mathematics of Muslim scholars. All of us, in some ways, related to religion, but not in a narrow sectarian sense. It was simply the culture of the time. So the idea of religion in a box, that is something that is, at the same time, they had to invent, as Talal Asad has brilliantly shown, they also had to invent the idea of the secular. And Charles Taylor has a wonderful book, The Philosopher from Canada, on how the idea of the secular has changed and become dominant. The different kinds of secular, with secular society, but even more intriguingly, a secular person. To think that we've gone within a couple centuries of not being able to imagine a world without God, to one in which God is really quite dispensable. We put ourselves, our secular selves, at the center. Well, that's a remarkable transformation, but I think one of the unfortunate aspects of it is not only the marginalization of thinking about the role of faith and tradition, which is another way of talking about religion, in human societies and human life. That's what you're talking about. But also it leads to a defensiveness, a kind of fundamentalist defensiveness of people for whom faith and tradition are important, who then embrace this idea of religion in a box and say it should be supremely important. Well, that's not that's not the way it worked before the Enlightenment either. It was supposed to be part of every other aspect of life. So it's led to these peculiar clashes between the strident secularists, like in Turkey, for example, and the strident fundamentalists, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh. We're living in an age where it seems like we either can live without religion, or we want to wear it as a badge of a kind of honor and of aggressive pride. And both of those, I think, are unfortunate extremes. I long for a day that I never knew several centuries ago, when you could simply accept culture as culture.
Right.
The Hindu tradition is a good example. I mean, one of the wonderful things about Indian tradition is the eclecticism of it, and the way in which different forms of religiosity, now kind of under the common term Hindu, but as you know, scholars who study such things really question whether there is a Hinduism, as if there was one thing, because India has always had this variety of different forms of religiosity, and so people who came with a Muslim or Christian identity were welcome, or part of the conversation. Oh, great, you have new ways of thinking about religion. We're interested in religion. Let's talk about it. And that used to be one of the strong features of India's tradition. And then to see this kind of harden into a kind of political agenda of Hinduism that you sometimes see in contemporary India is really, it's as disturbing in India as to see this happen to Christianity in the United States. And as a Christian in the United States, I'm very troubled by it, and I'm sure many people in India are troubled to see the politicization of Hinduism in the same way I see the politicization of Christianity. Or the politicization of Islam. Again, what a wonderful tradition where the very name means peace, and to see it, so politicized,
right.
and then the whole tradition dismissed by people who don't understand that this is just a small group of politicized Muslims. It's really, it's very disturbing.
It is.
For someone like me to see how religion and politics, which has always been intertwined, often in interesting and positive ways, today become such a point of contestation and of contention.
Right. Before we move to draw closure, I was thinking of drawing your attention to a weird formulation that has crossed my mind lately, that we are by and large a society without sacred canopy. Peter Bircher said it long time ago, but then it sounds more dramatically true today, that a society which is not interested in God, which is not interested in divinity, which is not interested in religiosity either, it is far more interested in deifying its leadership. Is far more interested in considering its spectacular leadership as a replacement for God's divinity and religiosity. It's that kind of society where some of these populist political figures are far more important than gods and goddesses. And therefore, it would not be very surprising to see that people are no longer chanting, the devotees, even Hindus, and this is my figment of imagination, correct me, because you have been Indophile for a long time and you have understood religiosity in India more deeply. So it's my figment of imagination that it would not be surprising if we find Hindu devotees chanting the name of politicians more than chanting the name of gods and goddesses. And it is in that kind of situation where one feels the importance of rebirth of gods and goddesses in society.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, I think that's a very astute observation, and I think that is certainly one trajectory. And it's not just in India. I also see that in the United States.
Right,
in
right.
the way in which in some evangelical Christian quarters, Trump is regarded as a kind of saint, which is astonishing considering he's one of the most irreligious, sacrilegious, moral persons I know. And yet, you know, somehow saints are able to get away with a lot. You know, that's one of the interesting things about the idea of sainthood, that you can abide a certain kind of sacred wackiness, and just like you know, gods and goddesses can get away with a lot. I mean, look at Krishna and the gopis. I mean, messing around with those cowgirls. I mean, that's not done in polite society. You can't abide that kind of sexual misbehavior. But he was a god, so you know, he can get away with it. And sometimes when we divinize our political leaders in the way that you talk about, we allow them the same kind of license. And unfortunately, that's, I think, what to some extent has happened to Trump, where evangelical Christians look the other way because he's, I don't know, he has this kind of divine sainthood. So I think you're right. But there's another side to what you're talking about that I find much more positive. And I see this in my own students. And the Pew Foundation has done a poll of the change in religion, and it's chronicled what I've just now talked about, the diminishment of mainstream Protestantism, the rise of evangelical Christians. But people who claim an association with religion in general, the numbers have gone down, as they have throughout the world, especially Europe, but also to India, China certainly. Even though strident religiosity seems to capture our attention, just the masses of people seem to be less interested in organized religion. But there's one response that in this poll that is gaining in numbers. That's not agnostic, it's not atheist, but it's none, N-O-N-E, none, not the nuns but N-O-E. These are people who are not Christian, they're not Jewish, they're not atheists, they're not agnostic. They say none. And when you ask them, they say, we're spiritual, we're not religious.
Exactly.
And that's my students. I teach courses in global religion, where every religious tradition in the world, and it's packed with students. Students love the course. They're very interested in religion. They don't want to join it, not for them, but they are spiritual, and so they want to understand religiosity, and they want to understand this spiritual connection to the world. And these are people who have a deep sense of global morality. They're concerned about the environment. They're concerned about human rights. They're concerned about the fate of the planet. They're concerned about civil order in the sense of social justice and decency. They're the people who go out and march for that Black Lives Matter, that there should be a social justice in the world. But there also is a spiritual component of it. These are people who love good music, and they love good fellowship, and they feel that they are in touch with a deeper aspect of themselves in their beliefs and their activities. And so I'm really quite heartened by this development, because it seems to me this is religion. This is global religion. This is the religion of the future. This is the old religion that I used to be a part of, for the mainstream Protestants, where we weren't narrowly, stridently anything, but we were just good people who had a sense of faith and wanted to fellowship. And I remember my mother telling me, if you want to be a good Christian, serve other people. That's what it was all about. And that's what religion is for these people, and for many of my students and friends in India as well. I see they don't go to temple, or if they do, it's kind of out of curiosity as much as anything else. But but they're spiritual people. You know, they have a sense of the depth of life and of one's relationship to the unknown, to an absolute dimension of what the theologian Paul Tillich called ultimate reality. What Gandhi spoke of is when he talked about God is truth and truth is God.
Exactly.
The sense that there is such a truth underneath all of reality. That's spirituality, and then it manifests itself in a deep social morality that wants to see social justice for all and wants to resolve that we care for the planet and that we are environmental stewards in a good way. And that's a religion I want to join. That's the religion of the future. So I'm really quite heartened by that fact.
I tried flagging right in the beginning that I understand this is one of the responses to the perceived vulnerability of religion. And the response is to turn spiritual and leave behind the religious denomination. Right. But the vulnerability of spirituality lies in the fact that there is a very elaborate merchandise of spirituality now. There are many agencies which sell packages of spirituality as if you go to the shopping mall and buy one of those packages and you attain your moksha and liberation. So
Yes.
I understand there is this future which has already emerged, but that future also brings its own type of vulnerability about which one has to be mindful.
Of course, religion is a human invention, and it's always prey to what humans do and how they use and abuse the culture around them.
So when do you plan to come to India next? I hear that you keep going back to your field and you keep meeting all your people, all your contacts who were at one point of time your respondents, but you have almost forged permanent relations with them, which is very unlike the professional and cold-hearted anthropologists.
Yeah, I was in the Punjab just in January, right before the pandemic. And then just last year, as you say, I was back in Jalandhar, meeting with all of the people that I knew from decades ago who are now in middle age and now are doing very well indeed. Bhutamandi, the area of Jalandhar, where I talked with many people, has become a very prosperous part of Jalandhar. And they've become very important politically. I just feel very proud of them. You know, it's true, these were subjects of a study, but from the very beginning, I had a great deal of admiration for them as individuals and as people who had a strong sense of social justice and a very acute vision of a society in which all are equal and had the intellectual imagination to be able to deal with this in a very sophisticated way, as I say, by creating a new form of religion. What an interesting, they have my admiration then and now. I'm just very impressed with with who they are and what they did. And I just felt very comfortable in being a part of them. And I was very pleased that they regard me as someone who, from very early on, let the world know about what they were doing and the kind of injustices that they were facing. And so they feel that I'm a part of them, and I take pride in that as well.
That's very heartening to hear from a senior social scientist that a field is not just a technical area of inquiry. It's a complete social domain where social scientist joins in various kind of relationship. It's not a technical process of rapport building. I look forward to any methodological writing emerging from your desk in future. But what are you planning to write next?
Well, I'm completing a book on how, because you're interesting. You say how much admiration I have for people in the Adda movement. Lately, I've been studying terrorist movements, and ISIS I don't feel quite the same kinship with. Although, to tell you the truth, I mean, my methodology is to try to understand the worldview of other people. with a colleague of mine, Mona Sheikh, who's her family is from Pakistani background, even though she's a scholar in Copenhagen in Denmark. And she also has tried to understand the worldview of other people in a book that she did on the Pakistan Taliban called Guardians of God, a very good book indeed. So she and I have co-edited a book called Entering Religious Minds, where we talk about worldview analysis. Our approach, our analytic approach, is worldview analysis. And then we spell out ways that this can be understood and be used as guidelines for particularly graduate students or any researchers going into the field who want to try to get into the mindset of other people. It's really basically what Max Weber was talking about, an early sociologist 100 years ago, using the German term Verstehen, which we translate as understanding. But Verstehen literally means standing inside. Standing inside, standing into somebody else's shoes, being in their situation, standing from their point of view. And that's what we're trying to do, to try to understand, to try to project ourselves into the worldview of other people, which is not always easy. And one gains a certain empathy in doing that. And I have to say, even recently, this last year, I was in prisons in Kurdistan, in northern Iraq, interviewing people who had formerly leaders of ISIS, and to hear them talk about the way in which they felt the Sunnis of Western Iraq had been marginalized by the Shia dominant government, and how their lives had been shattered, and they had trouble getting a job, and they were always left on the margins. You could not listen to them and talk with them without feeling a certain empathy for certainly their plight. Had no empathy whatsoever with their ideology and the kind of cruelty of ISIS as a movement, of course. But you understood a little bit better how a decent person could get wrapped up in that vision. And that's been my motivation all along in doing work on these extremist religious movements. It's easy to understand why bad people do bad things. It's much more difficult to understand why good people do bad things, why people who feel that they're on a moral trajectory where they're doing something good for their community get involved in the most horrible acts of cruelty and terrorism. That was what I was trying to understand.
So thanks a lot for this wonderful conversation.
My pleasure. It's wonderful to talk with you, Dev, and good luck on your endeavors. I'm looking forward to future conversations with you and with others on your podcast series.
All right.